Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale German Nashorn Tank Destroyer. Now, unlike many of the other smaller scale builds that are showcased on the ECA channel, in which those builds are built for private commission and belong to a private collector, the model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I often take on commission build projects from scales ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6th scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Now, this model here is built mostly out of the box. However, it does feature some aftermarket upgrades. In addition to those upgrades, because this is a vintage model kit, there are some key areas to watch out for that need some corrections. We'll be going over all of this information in this video. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around the model. And this vehicle here is the SDKFZ 164, also known as the Nashorn. The Nashorn was a German tank destroyer based off of the Panzer IV chassis that was developed during World War II. The Nashorn has its roots back in 1942, where the Germans first ran into the Russian T-34. At this time, the T-34 completely took the Germans off guard, and the Germans quickly realized that they needed something with a big enough high-velocity gun in order to knock out the new Soviet tank. Now, at this time, the German tank force comprised of the Panzer III as well as the Panzer IV, both of which were having difficulties in dealing with the T-34. Now, also during this time, the Tiger was still in development, as well as the Panther. The Germans did need some kind of a stopgap measure in order to have something which was adequately able to contend with these new Russian tanks. In February of 1942, the German firm Alcat had a design which utilized a very high velocity 88mm gun in combination with hull suspension components which were off the shelf from the current production Panzer III and Panzer IVs. Like with the other Panzerjäger designs which came before the Nashorn was to utilize a rear-mounted high-velocity anti-tank gun which was to be encased and surrounded by armored shields. The vehicle would be open-topped, however the shields would give some adequate protection against most small arms fire. Because the main armament had such good range to it, it was deemed that the thinner armor would be adequate as a standoff, since this vehicle can pick off enemy tanks at a distant range far beyond the guns that are found on the contemporary enemy vehicles. Also, by utilizing this design, the time for production decreased, and the vehicles were able to enter into production in a very quick, elevated rate. Alcat was the sole producer of the Nashorns, and approximately 473 units were produced. The vehicles saw widespread use on both eastern and western fronts, and the Nashorn, all the way up to the end of the war, was able to engage and knock out just about every Allied vehicle which was being fielded at the time. For the vehicle's main armament, the PaK 43/1 88mm gun was utilized. The PaK 43 was utilized because this gun here was very effective at knocking out very heavily armored vehicles at extended ranges. The same gun is very similar to the ones which would eventually be used in the Ferdinand and the Elephant, the King Tiger, as well as the Yank Panther. Another factor to the Nashorn's effectiveness had to do with the optics which were paired with the main gun. The Germans, being Germans, paired the PaK 43 with a very nice optical system. Because of this, not only was the gun high velocity, but was also equally as accurate, which made it a very deadly opponent on the battlefield. Now, because of the combination of this vehicle having very thin armor protection as well as a complete open top, it is very susceptible towards infantry attacks. In dealing with this, for last resort, the Nashorn utilized two hardpoints for mounting on either an MG34 or an MG42 machine gun. These hardpoints can also double act as an anti-aircraft mount in case a fighter bomber were to show up. However, realistically, again, these hardpoints are really meant for a last resort type weapon, as again, the Nashorn is an ambush predator and is best held in concealment and is designed really just to pick off tanks at long distant ranges. To fully operate the vehicle, the Nashorn utilized a 5 crew member team. Now, automotively, the vehicle was powered by a Maybach 11.9 liter V12 gasoline engine, which was able to output 296 horsepower. With this engine, the vehicle was able to reach a top speed of 26.7 miles per hour, which is pretty fast considering a vehicle of this size. Now, because of the fighting compartment being in the rear of the vehicle, the unit's automotive section was moved towards the center, and this is common for several of the other Panzerjägers of this period. This would also include vehicles like the Dicker Max, as well as the other Panzerjägers built off of the 38T chassis. Now, because of the success that the Nashorn's chassis had, which, by the way, Nashorn is the German word for rhino, the chassis lent itself for further development. Another rendition of this vehicle was known as the Hummel. What the Hummel was they basically took the Nashorn chassis, and rather than mounting the high velocity Pak 43, they mounted a large caliber howitzer to be utilized for a self-propelled gun. The Hummel, just like the Nashorn, was another somewhat successful vehicle and also saw widespread service during World War II. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the project. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1990s Vintage Dragon 1/35 scale SDKFZ 164 Nashorn kit. To me, this kit's a very interesting model in that this is the oldest unassembled plastic model kit that has been sitting in the stash. This model here was purchased by my father at a model show back in 1997 and has been sitting in the stash in this exact same condition literally ever since. This model here does have the usual surface dust on it. However, you can even see that this thing's been sitting so long that if I hold the box art in a certain light, the surface of the box itself is actually basically impregnated with a layer of dust. So it's definitely one that I definitely look forward to starting. These Nashorn kits here are some of the oldest kits that were ever produced by Dragon. This particular kit here dates back all the way to 1992. These kits here, like I said before, are some of the oldest kits ever produced by Dragon, and this kit has been out of production for many years now. To encounter a kit like this, you might be lucky enough to snag one either on eBay or possibly even at a model show vendor, or you might be lucky enough to find one squirreled away in a backlot somewhere at a local hobby store. The kits themselves are comprised entirely of injection molded plastic and do not feature any photo etch or resin components that would be added to the Dragon kits later on as the decade progressed. The Nashorn kit itself has been upgraded and re-released by DML several times throughout the last 15 some odd years. So tracking down a more recent release is a lot more easier than one of these original releases. Starting with the model's box art, here we have the opening scene, which is that of a whitewashed Nashorn with a very action-packed setting for that of the box art. Here we have, of course, the Nashorn front and center with a smoldering KV-1 in the background, as well as some other burning Russian tanks, which looks apparently like a T-34-76. And you have two Panthers advancing in the background scene. Right slightly behind the Nashorn, we have that of a squad of German soldiers on skis. And the entire scene is very well composed and very well painted. In fact, something like this appears to be reminiscent of the older pattern Tamiya box arts, which were present on their motorized kits back in the early 1970s. This is something Dragon always really had a habit on doing, is all of their AFV kits, they seem to have a nice emphasis on that of an action-packed box art. Now, when it comes to the illustrator, here we have the artist right here, which is different from their other artists that have done their box arts in the past, such names as Ronald Volstead or even Vince, and you can see the date here of 92. While on the box art, you can see that it still has the original price tag that my father paid for it at the model show vendor, which is $16. Also, you can notice here that the logo reads DML. This is also something that is more seen on these earlier first generation Dragon kits, as DML was abbreviated for Dragon Models Limited, and shortly after these kits came out, like I want to say in the mid-1990s or so, DML was dropped and Dragon just used the Dragon name for their branding. Here goes the Nashorn. This is part of the 135, 39 to 45 series. Kit number 06001. And as for the graphic design, it's pretty much typical for that of a 39 to 45 series. This is something that even stays all the way true even till today. On the side paneling, we have here some information on the vehicle. Here we even have the importer, which is Marco Polo Imports. They were the sole importer of Dragon kits during the 1990s. I'm not sure if that's still in effect today. On this side here, we have a sample unit that has been built. The outside out of the way, let's go ahead and crack open the box. Like I said before, this model is comprised entirely of injection molded plastic, and no more advanced materials such as photo etch or resin are going to be present with this model here. What's very interesting is that Dragon at this time would have these little inserts that they would staple on the inside of the box, something similar to like what Tamiya or even Academy would do for just a little bit of extra showmanship. All the components are molded in this gray plastic coloring, which is typical for Dragon kits of this period. Now, even though the plastic is this gray polystyrene, it is different compared to the type of plastic that is found on more contemporary Dragon kits. This material here has a little bit more softer in detail fidelity compared to the newer materials that are used on their more recent releases. Now, one interesting thing to point out is that the components detailing is not necessarily 100% Dragon. And what I mean by that is, just like I've mentioned on several of these other vintage Dragon kit builds that I've done, the Dragon kits from the first and earlier generations utilize components from Italy. This is definitely seen on their Sherman kits as well as also on their Panthers as well. Why was this done? Well, very simple. At this time, Dragon, again, was a upstart model company, and they did not have really a whole lot of money to invest in new original tooling, which is a very expensive process for anyone who's developing injection molded model kits. So, to cut some corners, what Dragon would do is that they would go ahead and acquire some tooling from Italy, and then from there, they would either build upon or add on to the kits so that this optimizes their profitability so that you don't have to invest a whole lot of money to develop parts like suspensions and lower hulls that are already on the market. Now, on this model here, this is actually, some of these components are improved upon the Italy retooling. This is also seen again on their Sherman or some of their Sherman builds, is also their second generation Panthers as well. What you're going to see here are basically nothing more than roided up Italy components for that of the suspension. The Dragon components, they took the Italy parts and they went ahead and improved them slightly, making them on brand new runners for Dragon tooling. And that's what you're going to see here on this runner. To point this out, here we have the runner for that of the suspension. If I flip it over and show the wheels, you'll see exactly what I mean. These type of Panzer IV road wheels with these deep cutouts for that of the spokes is something directly from the Italy road wheels found on the older kits. Also, the swing arms are also very reminiscent to the Italy tooling, but again have been polished slightly. These swing arms here actually have the ability to be mounted in a semi-functional manner where they can pivot and form fit to the terrain, which is identically lifted from the Italy kits, but on the Dragons this would be a moot point due to the Lincoln Link tracks that I'll get to shortly. Here we have the hubcaps for that of the swing arms. Like I said before, the detailing is present, however would be considered softer compared to the type of quality that's expected on more current contemporary model kits. However, having said that, these stock components here will be used without any problems. We have here the rear idlers and that of the front sprockets, as well as other detail components that are to be added. Moving from the suspension takes us to the lower hull, which is, like I said before, this nice little paper cubby that we have. The lower hull is very Italeri-esque. Like you get in focus, you can see the molded in bump stops. And also you can see the little squares, hopefully they come out on camera, that indicate where the return rollers are to be mounted. Now, of course, Dragon released several iterations of the Panzer IV at this time, and this hull here was a universal piece and would just be recycled and modified for the other renditions of the Panzer IV. Now, because this is that of a Nashorn, an extra bit of component is supplied, and this here is a hull extender, which once mounted will give you the correct length for that of a Nashorn. This is also true for their Hummel kit as well. Moving down deeper takes us to the upper hull. We have here a little bit of rust on the pivoting section for the gun. This is common on some of these older kits, as this is more likely surface rust which would have developed on the mold itself, and then once the hot plastic was injected, some of the surface rust just got impregnated into the plastic. It's not a big deal and not something to worry about. On the back here we have some molded in diamond plate. Some hex bolt fasteners on that of the front plate. We have here the side pieces. Note the intakes are integrally molded on. They are solid, they are not hollowed out any which way. And the last runner we have here is that of the gun. Here's the gun barrel, which is a two-piece construction, which is, again, typical for plastic model kits. There's some shells, ammo rack, and other components to assemble that of the carriage. Here we have a decal sheet. Now this is the original. As you notice, everything is still wrapped in its original packaging, and the decal sheet looks pretty good, and I don't see any problems with the decals. I don't see any cracking on or anything on them, but however, this is something I'll mention, of course, towards the end of the video when I talk about the paint. Here we have the instructions. Now, one thing that's definitely something that is interesting is the fact that this kit here will literally use all of the components here on the runner, and there aren't any spare parts, which is definitely actually a sight for sore eyes, as typically with Dragon kits of the past and even the present, you will get an obscene amount of spare parts that are just not utilized on these kits. This kit here, basically what you see is what you're going to use. Also, the model itself actually looks like it's a very simple build, which is pretty astounding, considering that this is an open-top vehicle, and generally when you deal with an open-top tank destroyer type model, you do have a lot of detailing to worry about for that of the fighting compartment and possibly even the driver's compartment. However, on this model here, that really doesn't seem to be the case. It's basically pretty straightforward, and for all intents and purposes, it's probably going to be a fairly quick build. Now on the bottom of the box, we have here two strips of track. Now these tracks here are not the kit originals. These here are two rubber tracks from an Italeri tank. I believe I picked these up off of eBay many decades ago and for anticipation of this build. However, these tracks here will not be utilized on this build, which is probably to some people's amusement. The reason for that has to do with, now, like, the reason why it even has those tracks in this box is that this tank here originally would have had individual link and lane track, which we have here on the instruction sheet. Of course, I utterly despise these track links, and there's no way in hell I'm going to use them on this tank. Those tracks are not in this box because they were pitched on eBay about 15 or 20 some odd years ago, and since I was going to use the rubber ones in their place. Unfortunately, I cannot use the rubber tracks on this particular build, not because they're shoddy in quality, it's just that these tracks here are not suitable for that of a Nashorn. The reason why I say that is, like I mentioned before, the Nashorn's hull is longer compared to that of a standard Panzer IV. Because of the longer hull, those tracks are just not going to be suffice for equipping this vehicle. In their place, I will be utilizing a set of workable metal track links from Fruly model. These ones here are specifically for that of a Hummel or a Nashorn, which gives you the extra links required to fill out the longer hull. Popping open the packaging, here we have the links that are going to be utilized for this tank. Now, if you notice, they're all made from a single piece of molded white metal, and their track horns are actually hollow, which if I could get one on frame, there you go. The hollow track horn is definitely a nice feature found on these track links, and will definitely make the model pop once fully assembled, built, painted, and weathered. Starting with the model's running gear takes us to first the road wheels. Now, the road wheels that you see here are the kit original ones and were assembled out of box. However, one modification that needs to be pointed out has to do with the inner portion of the road wheel castings themselves. If you look at the pictures that are popping up on the screen, you'll see that on the back end there are two very noticeable injection pin marks. These injection pin marks stick above the surface of the road wheel, and because of which will inhibit the road wheels during time of assembly and also installation. These definitely need to be addressed by the builder in order to correctly assemble the road wheels. Now, to remove them on this build here, I utilized a very sharp X-Acto blade, but sandpaper, a needle file, and even a Dremel, all of which can be used for the same application. Once this procedure is complete, the road wheels will definitely assemble in a much more smoother way. Another nice feature that the old Dragon kit has is that because it is based on Italo retooling, the suspension is actually form-fitting. If I put this red stick here and put pressure on the model, you'll see that the suspension will articulate in a very limited manner. This is again right as per the Italo retooling. However, it's important to point out that if you build the tank out of the box with the stock Lincoln Lang tracks, this bit of functionality is completely removed and is now null and void due to the Lincoln Lang static nature. But again, that's more on the tracks, and I'll go over that in a second. Moving from the road wheels now takes us to the sprocket. Now, the sprockets are the kit original ones, however, need to have some modifications made to them in order for them to fit onto this model. The first modification that needs to be addressed had to do with the sprocket assembly itself. The sprocket, just like on most models on the market, are comprised of two heads that get glued together. However, just like with the road wheels where there were those injection pins, on the sprocket this was also the case, and just like with the road wheels, if tried to assemble out of box, you're going to have fit issues which will throw off the sprocket's width, which will lead to the track not being able to properly time and fit onto the sprocket. Definitely something that's less than ideal. So hand fitting on the sprocket will definitely be required. Now, to further ensure that the sprockets can fit on the track, I went ahead and assembled a small section of track. With this section assembled, I was able to wrap it around the sprocket's teeth while the glues were setting. What this does is this acts as a jig, and it locks everything into place so that once the glue's set, the sprocket teeth will match in time perfectly with the track that I used here. Another modification that needed to have been made to the sprocket had to do with the fitting of the track. Now, the way the kit is designed is that you're supposed to permanently glue the sprocket to the transmission final drive hub, and then the track links just mesh around it. However, with the workable track links that I added, this type of a mounting system is definitely less than ideal. And I actually had to modify the sprocket to plug into the final drive housing on the kit. Now, the sprocket does have a small little nub that locks into a small little recess found on the final drive. Again, everything on the kit is just meant to be permanently glued in place. To modify it, I went ahead and drilled out a hole in the center portion of the sprocket casting, and I was able to take a section of sprue and slide it into this new section, which then created an axle. With this axle, this gives extra strength for the sprocket and keeps it mounted to the vehicle, which then allows the track to be mounted around it. And it gives it structure to keep and hold up the weight of the metal track. The sprockets are also not glued to this model because during the track installation, everything just slides directly into place, locking it further. So the glues are just not necessary. A final modification that was made to the sprocket had to do with some detailing. If you look at the sprocket, on the very center portion here of the hub, there's a small little recessed hole. This is found on all of the Panzer III and Panzer IV sprockets, specifically with this pattern, with this dish-type hub. On the stock tooling, the hole is not present, and with a small pin vise, this detailing was a quick little addition that really took no time and also helps bump up the vehicle's accuracy. From the sprocket, this now takes us to the top return rollers. These were mounted out of the box with no mods needing to have been made. And that now brings us to the rear idler wheel. The rear idler wheel on the Dragon Nashorn and the Hummel kits are comprised of 3 components. You have 2 sections that assemble the rear idler, and then there is a swing arm section for the idler mount. This is as per the real vehicle, and again is found on the Nashorn and the Hummel. Now, when it came to the assembly of this went through without any hitches and is assembled out of box. However, when it came time for installation, this was something that I deviated slightly from the kit's instructions. The kit wants you to assemble everything during the assembly phase for the suspension, and then of course you then mount the track and assemble the track and get it mounted into place. However, because of the workable tracks, I needed to have the track tension adjusted to the way you see it here. Now, if I was to go ahead and mount this section during the initial assembly, this would have left an opportunity for the track tension not to have been properly set. There is some movement for this section over here, and it could pivot a few degrees up and down, which will either tighten or loosen the track tension on this vehicle. So what happened was I went ahead and assembled the track fully, and at the very end of the build, just before I mounted the track on, I added a drop of glue to the idler mount, positioned the rear idler, and torqued it to a point where I was able to achieve the track tension that we have here. Once the glues were fully set, the track tension was where it needed to be, and there's no other fiddling or adjustments that need to have been made. Now, if you're working on a rebuild or you have the track tension slightly too loose, this can be fixed by either removal of a link if working with a workable track like I am here, or you may have to try to pop the rear assembly off and adjust it slightly, because on these Panzer IVs the track tensions are generally in a nice tight manner and you don't exactly see a whole lot of slop on these sections here as you would on something like a Stalin or a KV. Now, like I said before, the stock individual link and leg track was replaced with workable track links from Fruley model. The Fruley links are all individually cast, like I may have mentioned before, and like I frequently mention, these videos are always highly recommended. The one downside, of course, is being the cost. If you can forego the cost, however, they are definitely going to be a great attribute to your build. Now, one thing I frequently notice about these Fruley links from my other builds, and this one was also no exception, was that even though the links are casted to have their hinge sections hollow for the pin to go through, on several occasions the pin diameter holes tend to be smaller than they need to be, or they may or may not tend to line up, again due to the casting process. One tip that I recommend is with a pin vise and a very small fine Dremel bit, I go in and I drill out each of these track link holes in order to widen them so that the pin can go in further. By doing this, this will streamline the production and will also alleviate any issues that may arise. Once this is done, the tracks go together very effortlessly, and after an hour or two, you'll have enough threads for both sides of the track. Now, Fruley does make the track specifically for the Nashorn and the Hummel, which is important because you cannot use a standard Panzer IV track set to equip one of these vehicles because of the extra length of the lower hull. A standard Panzer IV is a lot shorter, and because of which the sets contain less track links. So keep this in mind in case you are going to build one of these vehicles. Just go forward and get the sets specifically designed for the Nashorn or the Hummel. Once fully done, however, like typically seen on vehicles with Fruity links, they are highly recommended. They give a nice weight to the vehicle, which helps settle it down on a surface, and with this tank having the adjustable, or I should say the semi-form-fitting suspension as before, will definitely help with diorama use. The tracks overall have a nice look and feel to them, and again are always highly recommended for anyone that is looking for an alternative to stock kits found on these vehicles. Moving from the main Caterpillars, this brings us to the spare track rack in the front. The rack itself is stock Dragon, and the spare length that we have here are from the Fruity links that I used for the main Caterpillars. The Fruity sets do come with enough links to not only fully equip both sides of the vehicle, but also give you plenty of tracks to make for use of spares. And even though I have this little section here of spares, I still have a good handful of these track links left over in my spares in case I need them for another project that may or may not come down the road. Either way, that's one nice feature about the Fruity links. They give you an ample amount of tracks in order to get the job done in case you accidentally botch up one or two during the construction. All the detailing you see here is stock with the Dragon kit. One modification I made was with a pin vise. I drilled out the toe section found here on the tow hitch. Another bit of detailing to point out are the two exhaust stacks which emerge from the engine compartment, which run along the side here of the under sponson and emerge here from the rear. These are the stock units and were mounted as is. The only modification that I did make though was with a Dremel. I drilled out the center portions, giving them a nice hollow appearance as they are just molded solid on the stock kit. Again, this is one of those type of details where if you don't have the tooling or the expertise, do not attempt it because you can easily screw it up. Moving from the spare track takes us to the travel lock. Now the travel lock components are all stock, as are all these small little fittings that we have here. In this section here is for a tow cable, which I did not mount on this model. And as well as all of these fittings are all comprised of the same runner bits. Now I will say that the parts are very tricky to remove off of their sprue. The sprues tend to be a little bit on the thicker end, which is come to be expected for a kit of this age of tooling. However, I was able to take all the components off, albeit in a very careful manner. This is one thing you have to be very careful about because you can easily oversand or overstip one of these pieces, and if they fly, you're basically going to have to scratch build the replacement piece. Now, the travel lock itself was carefully assembled so that it can actually be fully functional. This is something that's actually as per the kit and was assembled out of box. If you're very careful with the amount of adhesives that are utilized, you can get this component to work as well. From the travel lock takes us to the driver's compartment. All the details you see here are stock, with the exception of this small little rain guard that we have here. This was a replacement because the stock rain guard, again, was a casualty of the very thick and chunky molding. When it came time to remove it off of the sprue and even trying to remove the little burr on it, the piece just didn't hold up and basically just crumbled in my hand. In its place, with a small little strip of Plastruct, I was able to recreate the component and mount it where the stock one would have originally went. Similar story can also be said with the small little conduit for the headlight that we have here, only this one I was lucky enough to get it off of the runner without any problems. But again, it's things like this where you really have to be cautious when working with some of these kits. Now, newer kits are not really off the hook in this regard because a lot of them have some insanely small bits, which makes them almost impossible to deburr if you Club M40. But again, you have to really have a lot of patience in dealing with it, and if not, worse comes to worse, just gonna have to replace it with something scratch built out of some metal wire. Moving along, again, brings us to the Bosch light, stock unit, just utilized out of box. And here we have the tank's jack. Again, very rudimentary in comparison to today's tooling, but for this kit here, I just simply used it as is. Just a little bit of weathering was all that I added to it. While in this location, we have here the two front visors. Now, the two front visors are adequately detailed, again, for the tooling, and they do have their little vision slit found in them. One way to highlight them is with a little, very fine paintbrush with some gloss black added into the little recess on either side. Does make them pop a little bit compared to just leaving them overpainted with the base and the camo. From the vision slits, this now brings us to the antenna base. The antenna base on this model actually has two of them. One of them is on the inside portion of the fighting compartment, and the one is the version that we have here, which is in front of the vehicle. Now, the antenna base itself is very simplistic in its overall shape, but is good enough for the detailing at hand. In order to really make it shine, a little brush of black paint for the rubber portion goes on the bottom, and a swipe of brass for the stem. Now, if you notice, I modeled this vehicle without the antennas actually fitted, because attempting to mount an antenna wire to something that's this tiny is definitely not going to pan out. In fact, if anyone is dead set on having their old Nashorn with the actual antenna, I strongly recommend replacing the stock one with an aftermarket component. I'm pretty sure Aber makes a very nice one in brass, and would be a nice addition to add, again, if you have to have the antenna. Moving along now to the fighting compartment brings us to these small little tie-down loops that we have here. These are the kit original ones and were miraculously able to be salvaged off of the runner. The kit does give you, I believe, a few spares in case you screw 1 or 2 or possibly 3 up with the installation, but for this build here, I guess I got lucky, and they went on with really no mods needing to be made. Moving to the rear section of the vehicle first takes us to the rear doors. Now these are the kit units, and the kit units are decently rendered with their hinge detailing, and there's also a handle that's on the inside. Now, one thing I did notice on these doors is that if you try to install them out of box, you're not going to be able to get them to fit in the closed position. One of the doors are slightly too wide, and because of that, they will impact with each other, and you will not be able to get them in the closed slot. In order to fix this, one of the doors need to have some material removed off of the front leading edge. Obviously, you cannot remove it from the rear end because you'll delete and ruin the hinge work. Now, the hinges are a left and right unit, and one of them has this little strip that's integrally molded in. This is obviously the hinge that you do not want to mess with. The door that gets the material removed is the one that is stripless, which with a little bit of sanding with a file, you'll be able to remove just the right amount of material, and the door will then be able to be mounted in the flat position that we have here. Now, believe it or not, this is something that actually bit me on this build. While I was working on the model, I left the doors on the sprues. This was done because it makes it easier for me to paint and weather everything separately and then mount them on the tail end of the build. Because of the frail nature of these doors, if I were to mount them onto their locations, when it comes time to masking up the interior, they would eventually pop off, which is why I opted for the sprue method. Unfortunately for me, when it came time to final installation, the doors were surprising that they weren't fitting on correctly. Now, luckily, I was able to sand off the amount of material in a nice, smooth, and methodical manner where it did not cause any damage to the visible areas that we see here. Once the right amount of material was removed, everything just went on in the way you see it in this video. But again, this is something to keep in mind for anyone who has or is thinking about grabbing one of these older kits. From the doors, this now brings us to the fighting compartment. The fighting compartment details are again on the simplistic end, but were able to be mounted without really any problems. Now on this section here, you can see a small little radio. The radio is the stock original unit and again was utilized. Now again, the radio is going to be very simplistic compared to what people expect on modern tooling. Now the radio, if anyone again is building one of these models and really wants to bring it up to the next level, a nice simple replacement is to swap this radio out again for some kind of an aftermarket source. From the fighting compartment now brings us to the main gun. Now the main gun on the model here is both simple and complex at the same time. It's simple in that the pieces are somewhat on the robust, chunky end, which makes them easier to manipulate and handle, but are slightly on the complex end because of the amount of sub-assemblies that need to be assembled together, and in the order that they get assembled in. Many of the components are molded in 2 halves, so you're going to have some body work in order to contend with. This wouldn't be on the components like the breech, the main barrel, and on the main carriage, which again is not really unheard of and is quite common for the course. The components do mount in their locations in basically a very problem-free way. However, I will say that the instructions are very, very, very primitive, if not completely vague, in terms of some of the other fittings on the bottom portions here of the shield. So much so that I actually had to Google up the inside fighting compartment detailing on a real Nashorn in order to piece together some of the parts. However, after a couple Google searches, I was able to find what I need. Now, just like with many self-propelled guns and artillery pieces on the market, the breech can be modeled in either the open or closed state. In fact, on this model here, the breech is not glued on and is basically just held on with friction. If I ever wanted to, I could move the breech into the open position. Moving from the breech now brings us to the elevation system. Now the model is nice in that you can build the gun represented in a few different arcs of motion. This is nice as this differs up the type of build you can do, and it will definitely help in something like a diorama setting. Now the way this is done is that these two recuperators that we have here on either side are not permanently glued on, and instead just plug and snap into their receptacles. Where the things become tricky is on the bottom portion. There are two matching receptacles that would pivot along with these guys over here. The problem is that the plastic that holds those pegs in place is so small, tiny, and frail that trying to make it work is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible. So realistically, you want to find a nice happy medium point where you want to have the elevation set, and you basically set it in that way. Now, on the model here, I actually use white glue on the bottom in case I ever want to have the need to adjust the elevation further from the way you see it in this video, but that's going to be highly unlikely. Moving from the gun's elevation now brings us to the transverse. Now, one nice feature that this model has is that the model can be positioned in any way that I have over here. The way this is done is that the gun system obviously is not permanently glued to the model, and on this kit here the gun actually is held on with a friction fit type plug system. This was actually really beneficial when it came time for the actual painting of the model, because rather than having tried to mask up all these small little nooks and crannies, which paint would undoubtedly get in and cause some grief in trying to match the weathering, on the model here the barrel and gun system were painted separately, and I was able to thoroughly mask everything up on the inside. When it came time for final assembly, I just took off all the masks and just dropped the barrel and carriage unit directly in place where it needed to be. Moving from the rear area here now takes us to the main barrel and muzzle brake. Now this is one section that is absolutely important to mention for anyone who's working on one of these older Nashorn kits. There is a quirk with the molds and with the castings on these pieces that are very important to point out. Now the way the components are assembled is that both the muzzle brake and the barrel are a two-piece assembly. In that you glue the two halves together, you contend with the seam, and you're basically done. However, if you build the gun system out of the box, the area over here where we have the travel lock hookup and the muzzle brake will be canted ever so slightly. So slightly enough that I actually didn't notice it when the model was first built. The model here was finished back in late winter, and I did my typical filming and photography that I usually do. Well, after the filming was all done, I went ahead and tried to edit it on my computer, to which when I was on a scene similar to this, it stuck out like a sore thumb and I was able to catch it. To which after I saw the issue, my response was, well, basically. Now the model was fully painted, weathered, and completed when this issue arose. Now luckily the cant was in line with the muzzle brake and with the travel lock hookup that we have here. So this entire system was in line with each other, but it was canted away from the center line where it needed to be. In order to fix it, luckily with the Nashorn there is this section over here in the front. Well, right over here the seam line made a perfect location to make the incision. I was able to remove the gun off of the model, which again, it's not permanently held on, it's only held on with friction. It came in handy on this repair. With a X-Acto saw, I went ahead and very carefully and as straight as possible cut the barrel at this junction point right here. From there, with a Dremel, I drilled a small hole in the center of the barrel, and in the center of the remaining portion of the barrel, added a 1/16 of an inch piece of floor wire, and then was able to reinstall everything and adjust the cant of this section here of the barrel. By doing this, this now fully repaired the unit, and the cut was so precise that I didn't cause any damage to the paint and the finish. With the unit now repaired, I can actually elevate the travel lock and have the gun fit in its travel mode. From the gun, this now takes us to the paint and the markings. The paint camouflage that you see here is a two-tone camouflage pattern, which is green over Dunkelgelb, and then the weathering is my usual type pattern. Now, the markings are the original kit supply decals, and went on without any problems, breakages, or any other sort of issues, which is actually pretty impressive to point out, since again, this kit here is over 20 years old. I should say it's been in the shop since 1998, and who knows when this kit was actually made by Dragon. These kits do date back to the early 1990s, after all. Which, if anyone's a fan of the channel, shouldn't be too surprising, as I've done several of these vintage Dragon kits before, and the decals were never an issue, which shows the testament of the quality of decals that Dragon utilized in kits of this period. Overall, I'm really happy on how the build turned out. Like I said before, this build was the oldest unassembled kit in the stash and has been clunking around for over 2 decades. So it is a extremely fantastic feeling to finally get this guy fully built and placed in the collection. Moving along, this now brings us to the skill level and recommendation for this kit. Now, the model itself does build relatively simple and relatively quickly. This is in part due to the simplistic nature found on the molding and details found on the components. Keep in mind, this is definitely representative from the fact that this is an older pattern of kit. More modern tooling kits tend to be a little bit more complex due to the higher level of detail fidelity that is found on the parts. Now, in spite of the age of the kit's tooling, the hull components went on in a very fluid and smooth manner. The fit on these parts were pretty good. The only areas where there were really any fitting issues were, like I mentioned before, which were the road wheels, the sprockets, and the doors. Not to mention that weird quirk I found with the gun barrel. However, when it comes for the actual body panels fitting together, which for an open-top vehicle like this is very crucial, these panels went together without any issues. And as for the other parts that I mentioned before with those weird quirks, now that you know what to look for, you'll easily be able to correct them on your own builds. Now, even though the kit's details are simpler compared to modern-day tooling, the gun components still require a lot of small sub-assemblies in order to fully assemble into the completed unit that we have here. In addition to the other corrections that I mentioned, as well as the individual track links that are supplied with the kit, I cannot recommend this to a beginner builder. This kit here I would recommend for anyone who is an intermediate range all the way up to an advanced builder. If you've done a few of the Panzer IV series vehicles before and you want to level up to something with a little bit more complexity but something that's not overly complicated, this kit here would definitely fit the bill. Also, I strongly recommend replacing the individual static link and link track with the workable units that I have here. Yes, it does increase the cost of the build, however, the build will go by a lot quicker and with a lot less frustration. Now, because this is a vintage model kit, availability is not going to be as easy compared to some of the other renditions of the Nashorn that have come out in recent years from Dragon, as well as AFV Club and even the more recent release from Tamiya. This kit here will be something more or less that you'll find on an eBay auction, or you might get lucky and snag one in the back end of your local hobby shop towards the bottom of the pile. Of course, another place where you might find one of these kits is either at a model show or at some kind of a swap meet. While on this note, a lot of people are probably wondering about aftermarket components, parts in photo etch, resin, metal, etc. Well, this again is something that is best left to determination by the builder's discretion. By the time you're done with the amount of money and time being pumped into one of these older kits to bring them up, is it really that much better in the end of the day than just starting with a newer tooling kit? Again, if this is something that is worth it for you, go ahead, but again, it's best left to your discretion. Now, on the other hand, if you're one of those builders, and I know they're out there, who love a good challenge and have bins of spare components in both plastic and metal and all that, by all means, have at it. Now, because of the model's subject matter being World War II German, of course, any World War II German tank fan will greatly appreciate one of these kits added to their collection. If anyone who's trying to fill in the German zoo, so to speak, you can't have the zoo without the Nashorn. Outside of German tank collectors, World War II tank fans in general would also appreciate this kit, along with anyone who is a fan of self-propelled guns and tank destroyers. Being an open-top vehicle, this model here will also greatly enhance a diorama and has a lot of diorama capabilities because, again, of the open-top nature of this vehicle. Well, I think I've rambled on about this build now long enough, and with that, that wraps up this Vintage Dragon 1/35 scale German Nashorn Tank Destroyer. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where you can get updates on new model showcase videos like this build here, as well as project update videos when they get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more pictures of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on the ECA channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com, where there are more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching.